In class, we discussed the career of Leonardo da Vinci, and here in BC, we're quite lucky to have the only painting by Leonardo in all of the Americas, which was painted during his first period, his earliest period as a painter, when he was living in the city of Florence. Then we saw that in 1482, Leonardo left his adopted city of Florence for the city of Milan in northern Europe, where he became the court painter to Duke Ludovico Sforza and stayed in Milan for 15 years. He remained there. He would have remained there probably longer, but in 1498, the city of Milan, the duchy around Milan, was invaded by the armies of the King of France. And with Sforza overthrown in Milan by the French, Leonardo moved back to his hometown of Florence. It's when he moves back to Florence that he paints one of his other most famous works. The Last Supper was done for the Duke of Milan for a monastery that he financially supported. Back in Florence, Leonardo paints the famous Mona Lisa. Actually a portrait of Lisa Maria Gherardini, the wife of a wealthy merchant, but for some unknown reason, Leonardo never delivered it to Lisa or her husband, but kept it himself, and for this reason is called Mona Lisa, my Lisa, in other words, Leonardo's portrait of Lisa. Her name is Mona. And in fact, Leonardo kept it all the way until the end of his life. Now, it has some similarities to this earlier portrait, even though it's about 25 years later. Remember that the portrait of Ginevra da Vinci has been trimmed at the bottom. It's missing part of it. So it originally had very similar dimensions to the Mona Lisa, with the hands at the bottom being an important part of the characterization of the figure. That said, there are certain differences between the two. As you'll notice very subtly in Lost in the Darkness, that Lisa Gherardini, Mona Lisa, is in a chair. You can see the arm here where her hands are resting. We're not sure what was originally at the bottom of Ginevra da Vinci. We'll also see later that she's seated on a parapet as well above the landscape, rather than out in the landscape in the earlier work. But the changes I want to focus on are more sophisticated than that. I wanted to look at first at his increased use of sfumato. Remember, we talked about this term in class. It's from the Italian word for smoke. And it's a term that Leonardo himself used to describe the kind of atmosphere that he creates in his paintings, where there's a sort of smoky light that melds different forms together, that sort of obscures things rather than reveals them. And he had begun to use it early on. There's some hint of it in the background of Ginevra da Vinci. But in the Mona Lisa, it's everywhere. That smokiness that really ends up sort of losing things in shadow. As things move into the darkness, they simply meld and disappear with other objects, almost as if Leonardo sees the entire world as interconnected. Here's a nice detail of her face. You can also see how the state of preservation is not really the best. But you can see if you look at her eyes in particular, or even her mouth, that the crease of her lips disappears into the shadow, especially here on the shaded side. Or even the crease of her eyelid. Everywhere Leonardo can, he envelops his images in this smoky light. And with that increased sfumato, we have an increased sense of mystery. And I think that the face of Lisa Gherardini, Mona Lisa, adds to that. It's an expression that's entirely ambiguous. It's impossible to really tell what she's thinking. It's sort of a half smile, a knowing look, as if she knows more about you maybe than you even know yourself. This increasing sophistication that we see in Leonardo's use of the sfumato technique, we can also see in the background how the sfumato really obscures the different elements of the landscape. But that we have here in this detail up to the left of her face, we can see that the landscape in this work, unlike Ginevra da Vinci, is not just simply a symbol for her name, which is really kind of a simple use of landscape, really. But it's much more sophisticated. He sees the landscape as maybe perhaps revealing part of his outlook on the world. And that, too, is very mysterious, in part because of the sfumato technique. But you'll notice that the mountains appear almost as if they're erupting out of the land, as if they're growing, emerging from the earth itself, as if all of nature is in a sense of becoming. And the sfumato technique, like I said, enhances that, because as we look at it, it emerges and fades back into that fog. And so that sense of nature becoming, changing in front of our eyes, is enhanced, I think, by his technique. The opposite side of Lisa, to the right, we see more of the same, where even we see an element of fog sort of rolling across the hills, and again sort of blanketing down inside the valleys, swirling its way down, and then eventually seems to morph into the river that flows beneath the bridge and comes toward the foreground. Everything appears as if it's in flux. Everything appears as if it's changing as we're looking at it. And this, I think, comes from Leonardo's lifetime study of weather patterns. He was really fascinated by rain and fog and clouds. Here's a drawing in red chalk of a storm moving over a valley. And it's not a preparatory study for this painting by any means, but it shows his ongoing fascination with patterns of weather, if you will. But also, I think, the way in which nature is always evolving, always changing in front of our eyes. We also see in a number of works by Leonardo how much his interest in water and flow underscores his approach to solid matter, that everything is rendered as if it were water, because water is indeed always changing, always in flux. So if we look, for example, at the path in the background on the left, there's a sense that the roadway itself is almost like a liquid moving through the landscape. Solid matter takes on the nature of water. If we look at her hair, the way it flows down in rivulets, disappearing and emerging from the sfumato lighting, or this shawl that's over her shoulder, how it turns like water flowing through a canal. Everything for Leonardo is liquid. Everything is in flux. Now, as I mentioned, in addition to these more sophisticated changes, in more mature work by Leonardo, we also have various subtle changes. You'll notice the setting. She is seated on a chair on this porch. Later, people who made copies of his work included the columns on either side, which Leonardo only hinted at. You can just see the base of them, and a little bitty sliver on the left, but only the column bases. And later artists sort of made it easier to see, making more of those columns around. This probably came from new works of art that Leonardo saw when he came back to Florence. A number of Florentine painters were collecting pictures from Flemish artists. Hans Memling was a pupil of Roger van der Weyden, who we looked at in class. And this work was commissioned by one of the later factors at the Medici Bank, Benedetto Portinari, to be sent back to his family chapel in Florence. And so this is a new work for Leonardo when he comes back in 1498. And you'll notice that the setting in the background with the parapet, right, and the columns flanking the figures are in fact lifted from different panels of this work that Leonardo would have seen after coming back to Florence. Now, as I said, Leonardo kept this for his entire life for some unknown reason. It was never delivered to Lisa Gherardini or her husband. It was used, apparently, by Leonardo to teach his students to paint, and this is something he may have done in multiple occasions. This work in Madrid was long thought to be a late copy, sort of like the one in the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore. But recently it's been cleaned, and here's what it really looks like now. And you can see it's a rather exacting copy of Leonardo's work, maybe without the sfumato as heavy, sort of more clarity to everything, but reveals the same background that Leonardo has on his. And now, through scientific means, we've determined that it's in fact been painted right around the same time as the Mona Lisa. And apparently, Leonardo had his pupils either copy that work or paint from the model at the same time he was doing that. And then finally, to wrap up the Mona Lisa, eventually Leonardo left Italy altogether. He became the court painter to the King of France, King Francis I, or Francois Premier of France, who loved Italian art. We'll come back to him 2 or 3 different times in class. Interestingly, Francis I's father had defeated the Duke of Milan, but Leonardo then goes to work for him. He doesn't really care about politics. His loyalty, if you will, sort of for him is the alien almost. So he goes to work for the father of the man who had defeated his longtime patron in Milan. And it was in France where Leonardo actually died in 1519. And he kept the Mona Lisa with him for the entire time. He never, ever parted with it, which is, again, why we call it Mona Lisa, his Lisa. He kept it in his collection up until his death, and that's also why it's in the Louvre today. But as you can see, you have a whole lot better chance of seeing it in the classroom than you do in the Louvre Museum. It's one of the hardest works to see in person, as you get a sense of from this particular picture.